Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we are talking about The Thin Blue Line, directed by Errol Morris. This came out in 1988, and I would also like you guys to read the chapter in our book from John Pearson entitled Inspector Errol Morris Walks the Thin Blue Line. So that starts on page 103. So this is one of the weeks where we get a chapter from Pearson that is specifically about the film that we are watching. So a little bit similar to what we got with Parting Glances, he's going to give us kind of a little bit of a behind the scenes look at the business side, how Morris's film was produced and ultimately distributed. He was kind of involved in some of that, and he obviously knew Errol Morris personally, so he's able to talk directly about the film and about Morris in a little bit more detail. So we'll reference the chapter a bit. It's a pretty fun read, and he does offer some valuable insights. So one thing Pearson mentions in the chapter is that Morris originally conceived this documentary as being really about Dr. Death, which was the colloquial name given to Dr. James Grigson, who was a Dallas psychiatrist who, as Pearson says, he consistently appeared as a very friendly witness for the prosecution in death penalty cases. So he was brought in as a witness to confirm that the defendant would be likely to kill again if ever given the chance. So prosecutors liked him. He was able to help them secure more death sentences. So originally the film was supposed to be about Grigson, and Errol Morris received money from PBS, the public broadcasting system, to make the film. So that was the original plan, to make this film about Dr. Death. But in the course of conducting research for the film, Morris gets to know Randall Dale Adams, who we of course meet in the film, and he's learning about this particular case, which also involved Grigson as a witness. So he learns about Adams. He learns that Adams has been accused of murdering a police officer in Dallas, Texas, and has also been labeled a dangerous sociopath by Grigson. So ultimately, Morris gets more involved and gets more interested in Adams and Adams's case, and that is, of course, what the film will ultimately be about. So just a quick note about the production, because I do think it's a little bit interesting. We're going to talk about both the production and the distribution of this film, because they do matter a little bit, just as further examples of this trend that I've been talking about going back a couple of weeks now, how in the 1980s we see the emergence of a lot of independent studios, a lot of independent production companies and distribution companies that are providing more opportunities for independent filmmakers to get their films produced and ultimately distributed. So that's a big part of the independent film boom that we can track over the course of the late 80s and into the 90s, which is very much what we are doing. So we need to be just sort of aware of that change in the business side of things, how there are a lot of these independent production and distribution companies sprouting up. And also something, I just wanted to return quickly to something that I mentioned in last week's module, thinking a little bit more about producers. So last week we were talking about the Coen brothers, and I mentioned that Joel Coen typically directs and then collaborates on the screenplays with his brother Ethan, and Ethan also serves as producer. And I didn't really explain much about what producers do, and I realized I had not included that term in our film glossary that we saw back in week 1. So I just made a quick note in the week 3 overview about producers and what producers actually do. And I just mentioned that in some cases they might just be supplying money to get a film made, to get a film produced. But in other cases, they can be involved in the creative process. So I mentioned the line producer, which is a specific role that's very important because they tend to be on set during principal photography, during the shooting of a movie. So we've mentioned the director as sort of being the boss of a filmmaking operation, and in many ways they are when it comes to a lot of the creative decisions, but a line producer will be present often on set. They are in constant communication with the director. And it's sort of the line producer's responsibility to make sure that the production of the film is on time, is on schedule, it's on budget. They have to make sure that all the proper rules are being followed on set. There's a lot of rules about safety and certain rules about, different unions. They have to navigate all of that and basically make sure that production is going smoothly. So, like I mentioned in last week's module, in some ways the directors kind of do answer to the producers to a certain extent, at least when it comes to schedule, budget, and in certain cases creative differences can emerge. In some cases the producers, who are often representing the studio or whatever production company is financing the film, they often want certain things. The director might want different things, so we will encounter some creative differences like that. But just as a little bit of background, mostly so we could understand the Coen brothers better, I just wanted to mention that stuff about producers. But also producers get mentioned in the chapter about Morris. It's kind of a throwaway line, but early in the chapter, Pearson at one point mentions that he could only provide sort of moral support and encouragement to Morris because he was not a producer on this film. But then Pearson mentions some other guy who was a producer and was able to sort of push Morris to finish production, because apparently Morris is a notoriously slow worker and he was taking a very long time to finish the film. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse there of the role that producers do play. They are involved in production, often just making sure that the director finishes, stays on budget, stays on schedule, and does things in a way that will ultimately satisfy the studio or the company that's financing everything. But yeah, there's disagreements, there's power struggles within that relationship, but that, the relationship the director has with producers often will be important. So using that as sort of a transition, let's just think a little bit more about the larger production and distribution of this film, because Pearson gets into a little bit of this in the chapter. He doesn't really talk about it in much detail, but I just wanted to mention in case you missed it. So this particular film, The Thin Blue Line, was produced largely by American Playhouse, which is an independent nonprofit, or it was an independent nonprofit production company founded in 1980, originally by a consortium of public TV stations. That's how it was originally created. So again, another example of an independent production company that was working, outside, at least initially, working outside of the traditional Hollywood model. So they produced a few pretty well-known films. In addition to this one, they also did Stand and Deliver, which was also from the 80s. Some of you might have seen that movie. I remember having to watch it in school, like in high school. It's about a teacher in inner city Los Angeles who gets his students to perform really well on these standardized tests. It's based on a true story starring Edward James Olmos. It's a really good film, pretty well known. So they did that. They did The Thin Blue Line, some other movies that were pretty well received and pretty successful in the 80s and into the early 90s. But then something interesting happens, I believe in 94. I might be a little bit off on the year, but it was definitely in the 90s. American Playhouse enters into a partnership with a major Hollywood studio, basically to produce independent films. But they enter into this partnership with the Samuel Goldwyn Company, and that name might not ring a bell, but if you go back to week 1 when we were talking about history and the golden age of Hollywood and the old studio system that was in place really up until the 60s, if you remember that, this might ring a bell, because when I was listing the 8 big studios, one of them was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So later, in a future incarnation, it would appear as the Samuel Goldwyn Company. So like I've mentioned before, a lot of these big studios, they never really went away. They might have been reconfigured. There were a lot of like corporate mergers. A lot of different things happened. So the names changed in some cases. There were consolidations, separations, different kinds of business deals. And some of the old studios really are gone, like they just went bankrupt and ceased to exist. But a lot of them still exist in some form or another. So Paramount is still very much around in sort of a different form. Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, Universal, those were all old studios that still exist in some shape or form. So that's important to remember. Things change, but they don't change completely. A lot of those old studios remain big power players in movie making. So that's kind of what we see with American Playhouse. They enter into a partnership. They're not becoming, they're not getting taken over by Goldwyn. But again, like so many of these indie production companies or indie distribution companies, they make it on their own, and then when they get a chance, when they've developed a bit of a reputation, they've done some good movies, they often have a chance to either get bought by big studios or to become sort of like subsidiaries of big studios, or at least to enter into partnerships with big studios, because that will expand their reach, that will give them more resources, of course more money. So that happens a lot, and we're going to see another example of that when we talk about the distribution of the film, which is really kind of the end of lecture, because this film is ultimately distributed by Miramax, another former independent company that later becomes a huge power player in Hollywood. And you might mention that our book is actually put out by Miramax. So they become huge in a lot of ways, and we're going to talk more about Miramax today at the end of lecture, because they're going to play a pretty big role for much of the semester. A lot of the films that we watch, particularly later in the semester, are going to be either produced or distributed by Miramax. So we're going to talk more about that company, because they follow this similar trajectory that we've already seen. So we'll come back to that. For now, let's actually get into the movie, talk a little bit more about Morris. He's an interesting guy. Again, Pearson obviously knew him personally, but even before they met, I think Pearson had been sort of like following his career, going all the way back to Morris's first film, which came out in 1978, Gates of Heaven, which Pearson talks about a little bit in the chapter. That was his first film. As Pearson says, it doesn't get seen by a whole lot of people, but it did merit some critical acclaim. It's about a pet cemetery. Strange film, but it kind of establishes certain qualities of Morris's style that we would later be able to recognize, and we'll talk about some of his style here in a moment. But that was his first film, late 70s. It also happened to play at the Bleecker Street Theater in New York City. A theater that Pearson knew well. I think he might have even worked there at some point when he was younger. If you guys remember that first chapter, he's talking about the sort of underground film scene in 1970s and 1980s New York, and he mentions all of these repertory or independent theaters that often showed art films or European films, stuff that was outside of the Hollywood mainstream. And for a while, Pearson even works for some of those theaters. He's a programmer. He helps to decide what films they are going to buy from distribution companies and exhibit in the theaters. So he's in that world for a long time. So he talks a lot about it, and he's exposed to Morris through the theater world, the old indie theater world of New York. So that's how he kind of gets interested in Morris. He watches some of his other films, and later they end up sort of working together. But Morris is an interesting guy. He's originally, I think, from Long Island, right outside of New York City, but I want to say he moved around a lot as a kid. He ends up going to college at the University of Wisconsin. He was a very gifted musician as a young person. Kind of interesting. We also noticed this with Bill Sherwood. A couple of weeks ago in Parting Glances, we mentioned that Sherwood had originally gone to New York as a violinist to study music, I believe at Juilliard. And in this case, Morris was a very accomplished cello player as a youth, but he eventually leaves music behind. He majors in history in college, and then after graduation, he kind of bounces around, does some different sort of odd jobs, eventually goes back to school, attends graduate school at both Princeton and UC Berkeley, and he gets a master's degree in philosophy from Berkeley. And I think Pearson mentions that, and he also mentions that Morris was going for a PhD in philosophy but never finished. And then he leaves academia and gets involved in filmmaking, initially kind of on the West Coast, is my understanding. He sort of stays in the Bay Area, I think, at least initially, gets involved in documentary filmmaking in the late 70s, but really does not become a household name until later on, based on his work in the late 80s and then through the 90s as well. So, you know, he has an interest in philosophy. We're going to see that show up in this film. We can talk more about that, and we can talk a little bit more about his style. I did mention briefly at the end of last week's lecture that, you know, this film, along with Roger and Me, the documentary that we are watching next week, these really helped to kind of change the game when it came to documentary filmmaking in America. These were considered to be innovative documentaries. They were considered to be very different from what a lot of traditional documentary filmmaking had done. So a lot of these distinctions or differences might be a little bit lost on us if we don't watch a lot of old documentaries, and I, for one, typically don't. So one thing I did in the module for this week is I just posted a few clips to some kind of classic documentaries, some older styles of documentary filmmaking, just so you guys have a little point of comparison when you're watching The Thin Blue Line, and also next week when you're watching Roger and Me. I actually don't think Michael Moore is changing the model maybe quite as much as Morris does, but we can see some of the ways that Morris is maybe pushing this genre of filmmaking into new territory, into new directions. And we might already know at least a little bit about documentary filmmaking and the way maybe it used to be versus the way it is now. So we understand sort of the main goal of a documentary film. It is to document real life. So traditionally there was a pretty, you know, big separation between fiction films and documentary films. They have different intentions, different structures, different styles, different strategies and methods being used to tell their stories. I would argue increasingly today, we notice that a lot of documentaries borrow techniques and storytelling devices from fiction films, and that's kind of normal. We kind of accept that. I don't know that we question it as much as maybe people did several decades ago. And there's even a new term that's come about over the last, I'd say, several decades that gets used a lot. It's not always used in the most precise way, but you might have heard the term docudrama. And often The Thin Blue Line has been described as a docudrama. I find terminology and different kinds of language like this to always be interesting, because some people use docudrama as a synonym for documentary, and that's actually not very accurate if we're talking about the original meanings of those words. So what a docudrama is really supposed to denote is a hybrid film that combines elements of documentaries and also fiction films, what we might just think of as like dramatic fiction film. So a docudrama is really supposed to be a hybrid of the two forms. And the way we often identify docudramas nowadays is determining if they have dramatic reenactments of the actions being described or depicted in the film. This is a big deal. The dramatic reenactment was not a typical feature of traditional documentary. And we can see why, right? If traditional documentary was often more geared towards capturing reality as it really was, and sort of dispensing with that veneer of fictionality that we would find in fiction films, doing away with some of those stylistic traits that you would find in fiction film, then we could understand that they, traditional documentary filmmakers might not have had a whole lot of use for dramatic reenactments, because dramatic reenactments look and sound and feel a lot like what we're going to find in traditional fiction films, right? They're going to feel like a crime drama. They're going to feel like a fictional narrative, because those are the things we often find in fictional narratives. Heavily stylized settings, depictions of violence, actors playing roles. I mean, we see all of that with the dramatic reenactments in The Thin Blue Line. And that was one of the things that made people say, wait, this isn't like other documentaries. This doesn't feel like a traditional documentary, because we have all of these dramatic reenactments that feel like a fiction film. We have close-ups on the gun, we have depictions of violence, we have heavy use of shadows, light, really stylized visuals that, again, are supposed to kind of put us in mind of, fiction, crime drama, film noir, if you know kind of what I mean by that. But this made a lot of traditional documentary filmmakers uncomfortable. It made some people in the legal profession a little bit uncomfortable. And some critics and scholars who first wrote about the film were like, they weren't quite sure about the moral calculus. Like, they weren't quite sure if it was okay to tell a true story in this way, to do what Morris had done, which was import all of these techniques from fiction in order to create what was supposed to be a documentary. So a lot of those questions are still with us, and there's still a lot of different opinions about how much license a documentary filmmaker should take when presenting truth, when presenting reality. But just to kind of give you guys a little bit of background, again, I posted a few clips of older documentaries that you can watch later this week if you get a chance. But just to mention a few names, titles, traditions that you might be familiar with, just again to kind of have a contrast to Morris and Michael Moore, who are very different kinds of documentary filmmakers. But just a few names you might have heard, like Ken Burns. If you've ever seen a Ken Burns documentary, like, he's done a bunch. They often air on PBS. He did one on baseball. He did one on the Civil War. He did one on Vietnam. Perhaps your parents like Ken Burns. My dad watches all of his documentaries. They're super long. And Burns has a certain style. There's interviews, there's lots of lingering shots of still photos. Like, you can recognize Ken Burns' style, but it's still considered kind of a more traditional style. And some older documentaries that are still watched pretty often, still pretty famous. You could watch these to get a good example of what I'm talking about. One is Harlan County, USA. That came out in 1976. It's about coal miners, I think, in Kentucky, or maybe it's West Virginia, somewhere in there, Appalachia, that general area. That was directed by Barbara Koppel, who was a pretty well-known documentary filmmaker. That's a great film, but it feels very much like a news program. It's a very direct, sort of unvarnished look at these people's lives. So we don't get dramatic reenactments. We're just getting the real people talking, and we follow them around a little bit. Another film that's kind of cut from that same cloth came out a little bit earlier, called Don't Look Back. It's pretty famous, directed by T.A. Pennebaker, another pretty important American documentary filmmaker. That's about Bob Dylan. Pennebaker actually follows Dylan on one of his tours. I think he's in England, maybe, but it's kind of almost like a concert film, but it really kind of follows Dylan on all these different stops. And Pennebaker got a lot of access. Was able to hang out with Dylan in hotel rooms and backstage. And so a lot of the style that you see in those kinds of older documentaries is often referred to in North America as direct cinema. And that was a particular style of documentary filmmaking that really favored, again, no flourishes, no affectation. Let's just get that documentary of reality. Let's just document these people's lives, where they live, what they do. This is sometimes sort of compared to cinema verite, which was a European tradition. That's actually a little bit different. We don't have to worry too much about these nuances, but it's similar in the sense that cinema verite was supposed to do away with all the trappings of fiction film. So a lot of those filmmakers preferred to film on location, usually with small crews, maybe just one or two camera people, camera operators, and we're on location, right? No sets, no sound stages. We're using natural lighting. We don't have paid actors doing dramatic reenactments. We're talking to real people. There might be some interviews. There might be voiceover narration. A lot of older documentaries featured voiceover narrators who could kind of walk us through the events and explain things to us. But there'd often be some interviews as well, and just a lot of real life, just observing people doing relatively mundane things, going to work, talking with family. So that was cinema verite, and that's similar to direct cinema. That's what a lot of these documentary filmmakers of the 60s and 70s really believed in, is like, we don't want fiction elements. We don't want to make our films seem like they're fiction films. This is something very different that we're going for. And even Burns, again, doesn't really have a lot of those traditional sort of narrative devices. He's using more traditional documentarian devices. So Agnes Varda is another famous documentary filmmaker. If you guys are interested, she was French, but she still gets taught a lot. So, there's a long, robust tradition of great documentary filmmaking, not just in North America, but of course in Europe and throughout the world, that predates Errol Morris and Michael Moore. These guys aren't the first to make important, influential documentaries, but they are changing things stylistically, particularly Morris. So we've already talked about the dramatic reenactments, but also Morris does away with any kind of voiceover narration. Now, it's important to point out that not all of those traditional documentary filmmakers used voiceover narration. I don't think Koppel does in Harlan County. So that wasn't totally unheard of, is to get rid of the narrator and to really just leave viewers with the words of the people being documented, which is kind of the technique that Morris uses here, right? We hear from Adams. We hear from David Harris, who apparently was the actual culprit. We hear from the detectives who were investigating the case. We hear from a lot of other people as well. So we get a lot of those talking head interviews, but we don't get a narrator to guide us. We don't get an objective sort of godlike perspective from a sort of an omniscient narrator who can tell us, hey, this is what really happened. This is who's telling the truth. This is who's lying. We don't get that. And a lot of critics, a lot of reviewers noticed that when the film first came out. We don't really get that voice of authority to guide us and shape our own understanding. Instead, we have to rely on the people that we hear from. We have to rely on these different sort of testimonies provided by really a lot of unreliable characters. We might conceive of this as kind of a story featuring a lot of unreliable narrators. Maybe Adams himself is a bit of an unreliable narrator, even though he seems to be exonerated by the end of the film, but we might still have some questions about him, about his memory, and about his own sort of role in the events here. But yeah, so Pearson kind of gets into this. He gets into the debate as to whether or not this was even a documentary. Again, a lot of people recognize that it was very different from those older techniques. So perhaps now we're in the realm of a docudrama, where this is a hybrid. This is something a little bit different. They notice the heavily stylized reenactments. I think Pearson or somebody refers to them as almost like B-movie style reenactments. Very lurid, sort of, these scenes of violence. But again, notice how traditionally cinematic those reenactments are. The lighting, the camera work. Again, we get some like dramatic close-ups of like the gun in certain cases. And Pearson also mentions that the reenactments had their own production designer. And that's important to keep in mind. That should make us think a little bit more about mise-en-scene. Think about the set design. Think about lighting. Think about props. Think about the important role that props play in some of those reenactments. Think about the acting. Remember, we have paid actors, performing as these real people. So that's very much a sort of fiction element that is on display here. You could think about blocking. Think about how objects and people are arranged in those reenactments. Sometimes those reenactments are somewhat brief, but they're very important. Again, they import a certain style and attitude and mood that I think sort of permeates throughout. They are fiction-like in many ways. So we need to think about those reenactments. Think about what they look like, what they sound like, how they make us feel, and how they work with other elements in the film. People also mentioned the music. They mentioned some other possible creative liberties taken by Morris. So we tend to view a lot of that stuff positively now. At least, I do. A lot of critics would say, oh, he's innovative. He's creating a sort of new stylistic template. But at the time, there were a lot of critics. And a lot of those critics were traditional documentary filmmakers who were like, yeah, this might be a cool movie, but it's not a documentary. Okay, it's something else. We need to categorize it as something else because this is not a documentary. And one thing that was, one criticism that was leveled against the film, and I want us to consider this a little bit more, is that Morris is presenting a particular side of the story. He's presenting, even though he's not doing it explicitly, he's not doing it through voiceover narration, but there is an argument being made here, obviously pertaining to Adams, pertaining to Harris, pertaining to truth, the nature of truth, knowledge, and that also made some traditional documentary filmmakers uncomfortable because they were coming from this sort of cinema verite, this more journalistic sort of approach of just presenting things, presenting reality, and perhaps letting the audience arrive at their own conclusions, whereas here there's a particular orientation, there's a particular set of beliefs that it seems that Morris might want us to accept as true. But I would argue that Morris isn't necessarily arguing that there are any easy answers. I think he's just arguing that Adams got railroaded by law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and the majority of people today would probably agree with that. But to go back to, again, just some other stylistic things to notice, we've mentioned the mise-en-scene, the reenactments. Think about the close-ups, particularly close-ups of like objects. And then also Pearson mentions that we see a little bit of the footage from the drive-in movies that Adams and Harris were watching. Just little snippets of those films. That's interesting as well. So, Morris is incorporating a lot of different elements to create a different kind of documentary, or perhaps it's more accurate to call it a docudrama. But also, part of what makes Morris kind of famous and well-known today is his interviewing style. And he's kind of become renowned as a really good interviewer. And Pearson mentions this, he has this knack for getting people to talk and for getting people to reveal a lot about themselves. But we almost never see Morris. We almost never hear Morris as the interviewer. So he kind of effaces himself. He's not really visible. We're usually just left with the words of the interviewees. And again, many of these characters, like Adams, like Harris, they seem rather unreliable. We have, the couple who claims to have seen the traffic stop in which the murder occurs. We have the detectives on the case. And there are a lot of discrepancies in what a lot of these people are saying. We have a lot of reason to doubt a lot of what we hear. So there's a lot of questions about truth here, and there's a lot of questions about knowledge. So I mentioned that Morris has a background in philosophy, and that does show up. He's particularly interested in a branch of philosophy known as epistemology. You guys might know a little bit about this. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. And I think we see a lot of epistemological questions here. Because, again, we have removed that third-person kind of objective narrator who, and we find this in books a lot, too, in literature, right? We have that voice of authority, the moral authority, often, that guides readers. But we don't have that here. We would have had that in a lot of traditional documentaries, but not here. So as a result, Morris is forcing us to rely on the people that we're hearing from. And as we know, we have mixed feelings about a lot of these people. So what can we know? What is the process of acquiring knowledge? Like, how do we learn things? How do we acquire what we consider to be knowledge? How do we know that we know something? I think that's the question that Morris is very interested in. What is it possible for us to know? What are the limits to our knowledge? What is the nature of knowledge? Who can we trust? These are all questions that I think we have to ponder as the film goes on. Because again, even if we're pretty convinced that Adams did not commit the murder and that he had been railroaded by law enforcement, we don't know everything. Not everything is totally accounted for. There remain, some questions and some ambiguity that we have to kind of work through. And one question I always had, and we kind of get some insight into it, I think, from the film, is why were the cops so eager to believe Harris, who was a 16-year-old delinquent, driving a stolen car, when he tells them that Adams had pulled the trigger, that Adams was the one who killed the cop? We have different possibilities there, but that's a question that really undergirds a lot of what happens in the narrative that's presented, right? And we get a few different ways of looking at it. I think there's the possibility that a lot of the police were just sort of sympathetic to Harris, which might strike us as a little bit chilling, knowing what we know about his, career of crime. But we hear from multiple people during the interviews that Harris was kind of a likable guy. He was polite. Seemed to get along pretty well with the cops who were often arresting him or questioning him. But of course, we know Harris was a career criminal who would go on to commit many other heinous offenses. But there seems to be a certain way that he presents himself, and you might even notice it, when he's on camera in the film. There's a certain way that he seems to kind of disarm authorities and make them not really view him as a threat. So that's something to ponder. Is that just based on his age? The fact that he was very young, and we hear some people, I think maybe some of the local cops in Vidor, his hometown in East Texas, I think some of them are talking about, I believe in second chances, we don't want to ruin the kid's life. So did that play into it? The fact that he was young, there was still this possibility that he could reform and turn his life around, whereas Adams was a bit older and seemed to have more of that sort of reputation as a drifter, somebody who wasn't originally from the area. They didn't know him. They didn't really have any background on him. And they just seemed to have less trust for Adams in general. So that's interesting. Is that just based on appearance and age? Or are there other factors? Again, we know that Harris is from nearby in Vidor. So we hear from cops and people who knew him back in that town. And then we also hear from the cops in Dallas. But yeah, is it because he's local, he's young, he's a polite, young, white kid? Is that why he gets sort of the benefit of the doubt? Of course, Adams is white too, but again, older and maybe a bit more of a drifter. We also get that memorable quote from Grigson, Dr. Death, when he's describing Adams. He says he's the kind of guy that can work all day and creep all night. And that's kind of a good line, but we might question how accurate it is. Then again, clearly Adams didn't get fair treatment at every step of the way, perhaps, but we can maybe ask ourselves if we completely disagree with that assessment from Grigson. Does Adams maybe strike us as a little creepy? We do have to question why he and Harris were hanging out for so long. They obviously had some things in common. They kind of became friends. Again, there's a lot of gray area here that we do have to navigate. We might think Adams is innocent of this particular crime. Doesn't necessarily make us think that Adams is the most savory character. He seems a bit unsavory, a bit sketchy, but perhaps not the kind of vicious criminal that Harris proves to be. So there's a lot of questions about belief. Why do we want to believe certain things? Do certain things that we hold up as knowledge really just boil down to things that we want to believe, things that make our lives easier, things that make our lives more convenient? That possibility gets floated, in the film. You should remember Edith Morris, no relation to Errol, but she appears a couple of times, I think, and she kind of mentions this theory connected to the police and the capital nature of this crime, because police and the prosecutors were pursuing the death sentence. And because the victim was a police officer, there's this sense that maybe not everybody necessarily cared that they had the right guy. They just needed a guy. They just needed a culprit. They needed somebody to blame, a scapegoat, because when a cop gets murdered, there was a real strong desire, obviously, to solve the case and bring somebody to justice. But there's this implication, the suggestion that maybe for some involved, it didn't really matter if Adams did it, because Adams was there, he could have done it, and if it wasn't him, it was probably somebody like him. So we need to think about that a little bit as well. So just thinking about the way the film was received back in the late 80s when it first came out, a real wide range of interpretations. Some people almost viewed it as a work of investigative journalism, because Morris was obviously doing a lot of research, digging into the case, and making perhaps some new discoveries. And that should put us in mind a little bit of the true crime genre of modern day. I meant to get into this a little bit earlier, but think about true crime and how popular it is today. We see it on a lot of different platforms. We see it in documentaries. I would argue that documentaries have made a little bit of a comeback in recent years, largely because of true crime. We see a lot of these types of films on Netflix, other streaming platforms, but also we have a lot of podcasts. We have a lot of stuff on the internet that's also tapping into this kind of milieu. So I would say this genre kind of transcends just movies. We see it with TV, we see it online, we see it in a lot of different sort of mediums. But often we can notice a few common traits. These are often like deep dives into old cases, oftentimes, right? These are often cases that have already been adjudicated. There's already been a verdict, or, maybe the trial is ongoing, but the crime has already been, committed. So they're kind of going back to previous events, re-examining them, again, that deep dive where they really get into the weeds. They're unearthing perhaps previously overlooked details, but they're also kind of reconstructing a narrative, for the viewers. Here's what happened. Here are the key players, right? Here's the plot. Here are the characters. We're going to set the stage, create a setting. And so we see kind of all of that happening here in this film, and also the reenactments, the heavily stylized, fiction-like elements. A lot of modern documentaries and true crime shows, they incorporate those, right? That's very common. If you're of my age, you might remember the show Unsolved Mysteries that used to air, I think, throughout the 80s and 90s. That was a favorite in my household. Kind of a forefather of a lot of these shows that we see now. They were going back literally to unsolved mysteries, unsolved crimes, and trying to get to the bottom of them. We saw talking head interviews, some dramatic reenactments, but also voiceover narration, which kind of helped us to navigate. So some things that we see in Morris, but obviously he does away with the narration. But yeah, true crime is big. I mean, there's this impulse, I think, in this country, and really maybe it's just human nature. We really want justice. We have this strong desire, especially when we feel like justice has not been served. The real culprit has gotten away. A victim has not, been served properly, or has not been sort of done right by the criminal justice system. We want to rectify those kinds of wrongs. That's a real common desire that I think we can see. So again, not that this movie started true crime, not that it started all of these trends that we can find today in documentaries, but it certainly plays a role in popularizing a lot of that stuff and kind of normalizing a lot of it, because now we don't typically hear as much criticism when true crime or recent documentaries incorporate dramatic reenactments, when they sort of, have the paid actors and a kind of cinematic feel. That's just taken as par for the course. Whereas, 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago, it still would have been viewed as pretty novel. So we could view it in that kind of journalistic, investigative, real-life vein, but others interpreted it really more like a fiction film, kind of viewed it more as a Kafkaesque sort of nightmarish narrative, really centered on the power of the state and how you, as an individual, are really powerless against these larger forces, like the criminal justice system, like a police force. So there were a lot of comparisons to Kafka. Some of you might know Franz Kafka, a pretty famous European novelist. I think he was Czech originally, from Prague. Perhaps best known for The Metamorphosis, but he also wrote a novel called The Trial, which I think kind of shows up a little bit here with Morris. That's a book about just this regular guy. He's like a clerk for some government office. He gets arrested and pulled out of his home one day, and he's never quite sure what crime he's being accused of. It's never really made clear to him, but he kind of gets railroaded in a way not unlike Adams. He's sort of just pushed through all these different bureaucratic channels. He's mistreated by the police. He doesn't understand what's going on. Nobody will really explain it to him. So it becomes this kind of surrealistic, nightmarish scenario where he feels very trapped and very powerless. So we can see some parallels. Adams is in a similar position, but I would argue Adams is in some ways even more trapped and powerless because he's very marginalized as a person. Like, the protagonist in The Trial is just sort of a normal middle-class guy who would never expect to be in trouble. I get the feeling that this probably wasn't the first time Adams had an encounter with the police. Again, he seems like a little bit of a strange guy, kind of a marginalized guy, somebody who kind of drifts around, doesn't have a lot of stability or roots. And people like that are, sort of easier to take advantage of. They don't have anybody who will support them or advocate on their behalf. Of course, Adams is lucky that Morris comes along. If it hadn't been for Morris, he probably would not have had the resources to ever get sort of a second chance to hear his side, to get his side of the story out there. So there is that, critics have pointed out that, this film feels a little bit like Kafka. It's surrealistic. It feels like a nightmare. One called it more waking nightmare than docudrama. Again, making this comparison, saying it's not even a docudrama. It just feels like a work of fiction at times. Somebody else called it a moody horror story. And again, the reenactments in particular sort of bring that mood in, but maybe even the interviews, even just hearing Adams narrate some of these events, it is a little bit frightening or disturbing. It might give us some horror or thriller vibes at times. And somebody else referred to it, at the very least, as a tale of justice gone wrong and the extreme flimsiness of our criminal justice system. And I think that's hard to disagree with, right? We see that it's not hard for an innocent person who maybe got mixed up in a bad situation. It's not hard for somebody like that to sort of be victimized by the system. And that's a larger point, again, that Kafka was making, that any individual, no matter who you are, innocent or guilty, no matter who you are powerless in the face of, state or national bureaucracy. These bigger systems, these bigger sources of power can just, crush you regardless of what you've done or who you are. So we might see a little bit of that here. It's very easy for our justice system to maybe go wrong and to not serve people properly. It can go wrong pretty easily, but we might even think about our own personal frameworks of understanding, our own ways of organizing and understanding knowledge. They can go wrong. Our memories can go wrong. The things that we think are true can be disproven. So it's not just that the criminal justice system can't always be relied on, but maybe our own knowledge cannot always be safely relied upon either. Okay, so I think ultimately from kind of our modern perspective, we can see that Morris strikes a pretty good balance here between conveying information and also, sort of walking us through this complex case on one hand, and also entertaining us, keeping us engaged with a lot of these techniques borrowed from narrative fiction film. And again, nowadays, a lot of documentaries do that. But just before we move on and talk about distribution, just a final thought connected to the film, going back to the title. We probably recognize the title as a phrase that's often used in relation to the police in this country. This idea that the only thing separating a lot of regular people from violence and mayhem and, trouble is that thin blue line provided by law enforcement. And that gets disputed. Not everybody sees it that way, but that is an idea that's been around for a long time, that thin blue line is what keeps most of us safe. It's what keeps most of us secure in our daily lives. That's not true for all people, probably, but that might accurately represent how some people feel. But a lot of critics pointed out that the way Morris is using that phrase might be a little bit different here. I mean, he might be using the phrase kind of ironically because the police don't really protect Adams all that much in this particular scenario. But also, we might repurpose the metaphor and we might think about a thin line that separates sort of us from disaster, or that, that thin line that separates us from chaos and mayhem. Maybe it's not really police necessarily, but it is a thin line. And we can sort of define that thin line however we want. Is it the police and the court system? And when they go wrong, we go down. When they do well, we're protected. Is it as simple as that? Or does the line pertain more to perception and knowledge? Are we only is the only thing keeping us from trouble the way that other people perceive us, or the knowledge that other people have of us? If they have the right kind of knowledge, if they have a positive perception of us, we're safe. If they think we're a creepy drifter, regardless of what we actually did, we're not safe. Is it something like that? So what is the thin line? Is there a thin line between, stability and comfort and, on one side and mayhem and violence on the other? And if there is a line, how do we define it? How do we describe it? Is it police? Is it knowledge? Is it Errol Morris? What is it? And what is Morris trying to tell us about it? Okay, so now let's wrap up by talking about distribution and Miramax. So, I've already mentioned that this film was purchased and then distributed by Miramax. So what was Miramax? So we'll talk about what it was, and then we'll have to talk about what it becomes, because it's a pretty interesting transition. But again, typical of a lot of these independent production and distribution companies that sprouted up throughout the 80s and 90s. So Miramax began its life as a distribution company, an independent distribution company founded by the Weinstein brothers, Bob and Harvey. And we know who Harvey Weinstein is by now, and we do have to talk about him a little bit more. But we'll talk about his infamy in a moment. But they found this distribution company in the late 70s in Buffalo, New York, about as far from Hollywood as you can get. And initially, they start out just distributing concert films. And that's pretty much all they do. But then in the 1980s, they get involved in home video. The home video market. So they're still a distribution company. Largely what they're doing is they're acquiring the rights to certain films, and then they are releasing those films on home video. And we've mentioned the rise of home video, how important it is throughout the 80s. Pearson's already mentioned Blockbuster. So by the late 80s, home video is becoming pretty normal, pretty typical for a lot of Americans. You can go to the store, rent some VHSs, come home and watch them at your leisure. So a big part of their early success was getting involved in the home video market and selling movies or releasing the rights to movies so they could come out on video. But then later, they got involved in independent film production. So this was a pretty typical move, starting out with just distribution and then moving into production later as they got a little bit bigger and more successful. So they start producing independent films, and then they also are distributing those independent films either to exhibition venues like theaters, but also making them available on home video. So for those of you who might be of my age or of a similar generation to me, you probably remember the old insult often leveled at movies that they were straight to video. That was a very specific thing that pertained to this era, because often if movies were thought of as, you know, maybe not very good, made on really cheap budget, kind of like B movies, they often would not get a theatrical release. Instead, they would just immediately go to home video, or they might play on TV, but they would never actually play in theaters. So the assumption often was, if that was your fate, you were obviously a bad movie that most people didn't want to watch. That wasn't always the case. Sometimes it was just an indie movie, a small budget movie that just never got a theatrical release because they never got distributed on a sort of wide scale. But that was sort of a common insult. Oh, it's straight to video, so you know it sucks. But again, the Weinsteins were involved in some of those straight to video movies, and then they branch out into production. So over the course of the late 80s and into the 90s, Miramax gets pretty big because they start producing and distributing some very successful independent films. So they were just on the distribution side for a couple of movies that we're going to watch, Pulp Fiction and Clerks. We'll see those later in the semester. But they also produced a very important film called Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which we are not watching. But it came out in 1989, which is a very important year for us, and we're going to be talking about that year next week because Roger and Me also comes out in 89. And there's a whole chapter about that year, so we'll read that from Pearson. But Sex, Lies, and Videotape, directed by Steven Soderbergh, was a part of the big breakthrough of indie film in 89. So they distributed that. They also distributed The Crying Game, which came out a few years later, another very successful film. And they were also involved in production. So they produced and distributed Shakespeare in Love. That's going to be our final film. Flirting with Disaster, a sort of underwhelming Ben Stiller vehicle from the mid-90s. And also a film called Heavenly Creatures, which was pretty big in the 90s, starring Kate Winslet, a young Kate Winslet, and directed by Peter Jackson before he became a household name thanks to Lord of the Rings. So between producing and distributing, Miramax got involved in some big independent films that were critically acclaimed and pretty popular with viewers. So their reputation grows, and that allows them in '92 to strike a deal with Paramount, one of those big studios, one of those old big 8 studios from the golden age of Hollywood, they enter into this deal with Paramount to where they can start distributing the movies they're producing, their independently produced movies. They can now distribute them through Paramount. So they can get wider theatrical releases. They get the money and the resources of this big, powerful studio. And that was obviously a common move for independent companies like them to make. But their deal with Paramount would not last for very long. And again, just a final footnote, that deal originally only included video rights and TV rights. So at first, Paramount was like, yeah, we'll distribute your little small indie films to direct, straight to video and maybe to TV. That's it. But then later, they said, you know what, we'll include theatrical distribution as well, recognizing potential. But that deal didn't last long, because just 1 year later, maybe 2 years later, in 93 or 94, Miramax is purchased by the Walt Disney Company, as Disney makes its first foray into major feature film movie making. So a lot of people would say, if you think Miramax was independent, even after that deal with Paramount, because it was, kind of a partnership, a little bit like what American Playhouse had done years earlier with Goldwyn, maybe you thought they were independent then, but certainly they ceased to be independent once they got purchased by the Walt Disney Company. And that's probably a fair point, but they remained somewhat autonomous. Miramax remained a little bit separate from the rest of Disney. They were allowed to sort of operate separately. The Weinsteins ran it really without a whole lot of oversight or direct oversight from Disney. So that's why some people continued to consider Miramax as an independent studio even once they had gotten purchased by Disney. You guys can look at it however you want, but we are going to see a lot of Miramax movies, particularly later in the semester once we move up into the 90s. The Thin Blue Line is the first time we're experiencing them. They were the distributors for the Thin Blue Line. So, but again, they're going to keep showing up with future films. So, because we are going to talk more about Miramax and their sort of outsized role in independent film culture, particularly in the 90s, we have to at least briefly talk about Harvey Weinstein, which is, of course, unfortunate. We probably know who he is, and he's a very unsavory character to discuss. But we have to kind of reckon with him, with Miramax, and the roles they played, and a lot of the historical developments that we are studying in this class. So you probably know who Harvey Weinstein is by now. The former head of Miramax, now disgraced and convicted rapist. He is currently serving a 23-year prison sentence. He was accused, tried, and convicted of multiple counts of rape. And that happened back in 2018. I think he was sentenced, but you guys probably know that a lot of these allegations against Weinstein first really surfaced back in 2017 at the beginning of the Me Too movement. So he wasn't the only focus of Me Too, but a lot of the sort of early work in that sort of movement was centered around a lot of his accusers coming forth with their stories. So ultimately, more than 80 women made allegations of either sexual harassment or sexual abuse or both perpetrated by Weinstein. And of course, yeah, he is serving a long jail sentence. He won't be eligible for parole until he's 87. And I think he's currently he's on trial again in a different jurisdiction for more of the same charges. So I'm no legal expert. I don't know if he's going to be found guilty again, but it seems likely that he will die in prison. He's an elderly guy by this point. He's probably never going to get out. And of course, many of these allegations have a lot of substantiation, a lot of corroboration. So we know who he is. We know that he was a sexual criminal for a long time, a predator. And what's a little bit disturbing about Weinstein, and if any of you are film nerds, if you read about Hollywood, if you kind of like those insider accounts, you might know that long before Me Too, long before 2017, there were pretty open rumors about Weinstein and his behavior and the way he was, the way he would treat women, particularly actresses who were auditioning for roles in movies that were being produced by Miramax. So we kind of have to remember what Weinstein's role was as studio head. he was in charge of this increasingly powerful studio, and he was in charge of ultimately deciding what was going to get made, like who was going to get financed, and also casting decisions. Who was going to play, who would play the main roles in the films. He had a fair amount of input. He was sort of involved a little bit in some of the creative decisions that were going into these films. And as we read on in the book, we're going to notice that, Weinstein had personal relationships with some of these filmmakers, like Kevin Smith, like Quentin Tarantino. He was personally acquainted with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, who pitched Miramax the idea for Good Will Hunting. So, he was not just involved in financing and, a source of money. He wasn't just running the studio. He was a bit involved in creative decisions as well, and he certainly took an interest in which actresses were going to be cast in these films. So people knew that Weinstein was a predator. Like there were rumors, there were jokes, and a lot of this work has been done by journalists. Like you can go back through the archives if you want to. It's a little bit disturbing, but you can go back to like award shows from decades ago, like the Golden Globes from 10 or 15 years ago. And sometimes the presenters at those shows would make jokes, about Weinstein, like, oh, make sure you're not left alone in a room with Harvey. And, as uncomfortable as it makes us now, people would laugh. It was often treated as a joke. The fact that he was very lecherous and, would treat women as sexual objects. I'm not sure that people knew the full extent. I think a lot of entertainment journalists and even actors and directors who knew him and were later questioned about it, many of them would say, a little bit like Grigson describing Adams. They would say, we thought he was a creep, we thought he was creepy, but we didn't realize he had committed such heinous crimes. We can decide if we believe them or not. But his behavior was kind of an open secret in Hollywood for a long time. So we have to maybe reckon with that as well. But he amasses a great deal of power as Miramax continues to churn out these really successful indie films throughout the 90s. And by the end of the 90s, he's really kind of reached the apex of his power. So if you guys read any of those accounts, anything that came out as part of the Me Too movement, you'll know that, some really famous actresses were part of, this large group that were talking frankly for the first time about what he had really done. So Gwyneth Paltrow, Rose McGowan, Mira Sorvino, if you watch movies in the 90s, they were all pretty famous and successful. And in the case of Sorvino, we've learned now that she was kind of blacklisted. She kind of stopped getting roles, and her career took a real nosedive after she rejected Weinstein's advances and was able to escape from him. So not only was he subjecting women to this treatment, but if they were able to somehow resist him or get away, he would often, discourage others from casting them. He would actively try to harm their careers. So we don't need to spend a ton of time talking about him and his crimes, but we can't forget about them. We cannot dismiss them because they might make us uncomfortable, because the rise of Miramax, the rise of Weinstein, it does contain some stuff we sort of have to reckon with. And of course, we can't avoid the fact that Miramax is putting out a bunch of the movies that we watch. So, your opinion of the movies, obviously, they don't have to change. Your opinions of these individual films don't need to change, but we need to know the role that Weinstein plays, but maybe more importantly, the role that Miramax plays, and we need to think about how somebody like Weinstein can acquire so much power within an independent studio like Miramax. And what many thought in sort of the aftermath of his court case is, what this maybe shows is like that hierarchical power structure that we saw back in the golden age of Hollywood, where studio heads kind of ran everything, were involved with production, distribution, exhibition, could make or break careers. We thought we had moved away from that. We thought the new American cinema of the 70s, we thought the independent American cinema boom of the 80s and 90s had moved us away from those old hierarchical power structures that were usually run by men and were often very oppressive and unjust. we thought we had moved away from it. I think Weinstein and Miramax just serve as a good reminder that we have not. And a lot of independent film studios, once they got big, they began to function much like those old studios did decades ago. So some things change, but a lot of things stay the same. So that's a reckoning that we are still sort of undergoing, I think. Anybody who loves movies, anybody who loves Hollywood movies, people have acknowledged that business models need to change, diversity at the top, who's making decisions, you know, that needs to change a little bit, and we need to do some more active things to make sure that we don't have more Harvey Weinsteins. All right, so we'll come back to a lot of that in the future. For now, get ready for your next documentary. That's Roger and Me. We'll check it out next week, and we're also going to talk about the year 1989 and the larger significance of it in this sort of larger history of independent film that we're learning about. So get in touch with me if you need anything, if you need access to the films, if you have questions, especially with our first response paper coming up, just let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.